Okay, so we're talking about sword construction. For the majority of fighters, they like to start out with a sword and shield. It's something that most people have a go at in their SCA fighting career. So we thought we'd have a little bit of a chat about construction, the benefits of those things, and things that might be worth considering when making your sword. So sword length is a good place to start. It's going to have an impact on your fighting style, it's going to depend on your height and what you're working on. So short swords, they can be beneficial in terms of close combat. You can have a lot more maneuverability and they're often better for cuts in those circumstances. But they do result in a bit of a lower initiative, like you don't often get the first swing. You do have to make a bit more of an effort to get closer to your opponent. And when powering those shots, they're more reliant on your shoulder and your body movement to power them. A longer sword, on the other hand, is going to be better for a sniping game, so you'll be further back, you'll often get the first shot, and they can be better when you're throwing a lot of snaps. But unfortunately they can be tip heavy because they are longer. They're also slower to start, but they do gain momentum. So when you're initially starting that shot, you're going to be powering it with your shoulder, but then the weight and movement of the sword are going to help to power your shot. Because they are longer and often tip heavy, it is also something worth considering that they do put a bit more pressure through your forearm muscles, and you're reliant on those forearm muscles to hold the sword up, particularly if you are starting in a forward-facing guard. Now, that can be mitigated to a certain extent by having a heavier basket hilt, so something that might be a metal basket hilt, or having the basket hilt inset from the end of the sword. The other thing that's worth thinking about with these swords is they're often heavier, so you're going to have to make sure that you're in a much better position for your shoulder and your body so that you're not causing overuse injuries. Now, when you're using a sword, obviously you're throwing sword strikes, which generates force. How much force is generated depends on how fast you're throwing your shot, what part of the sword you're striking with, and what you're hitting. So if you're hitting someone's leg, it's going to be less force generated back into your body than if you hit the edge of their shield, for instance. Now, in most swords there'll be a sweet spot along the blade where that is the best spot. You know, most fighters will know, they'll be able to feel that it was a good shot, and the majority of that force will be transferred into their opponent. When you hit with any other part of the blade, so like a tippy shot or a shot that's in that first percussion point, there's a higher chance that that force is going to transfer back into your own wrist and elbow. And it's important to keep that in mind, because that is where, if you're throwing those shots all the time and you're missing, or you're having situations where you are having that force traveling back into your own body, you can cause yourself some overuse injuries around your elbow. And that's where people start to find sort of tennis elbow or golfer's elbow, where they're having that pain around the elbow. In terms of decreasing that back force, sometimes a heavier sword can be of benefit because there's more weight to it, and more of the force is taken up by the blade before it then gets to you. And other things that you can do would be softening the grip, so you can get things like tennis wraps, which can be softer, or hockey wraps, which they use to soften that vibration that can come back, which can be helpful in reducing that force coming back to your arm. Other things to think about when setting up your sword would be grip size. So most swords come as just a piece of rattan that most people would then shave back a blade, and you get to choose how far you would shave that back. Now, generally speaking, when choosing a grip size, you want it to be the largest possible comfortable grip, because that places the muscles in your forearm at a relaxed position. So the muscles that close your hand are at a similar length to the muscles that stretch the fingers out. If you have too small a grip, you're going to have a really tight grip to hold the sword, which is going to sort of tire out those muscles that close your fingers, as opposed to if the blade is too big, your grip will be weaker because you haven't got a good position in your hand. Now, in terms of determining how big that grip should be, when sizing up things like tennis rackets, which are a similar sort of circumstance to our single-handed swords, it's generally recommended that you measure from the tip of your finger to the first, like the crease that's closest to your wrist on your hand, and that would be an approximate measure of your optimum circumference of your blade. Obviously there's going to be personal differences, so some people will prefer a slightly smaller grip, but the main thing is to make sure that your hand's in a relaxed position. And that's going to be throughout your fight. So when you're starting your shot, you should have your hand, you know, a little bit gripped because you're trying to accelerate the sword. But once it's accelerated, you should be able to have a fairly loose grip until you're right to striking the surface. Other ways that people prepare the grip of their sword would be to shave down the sides. So often people will shave an edge so that way they can tell where their blade is. Other things to think about is the length of your sword. So we've talked already about how that can affect your fighting style, but it would also affect your height. So if you have a sword that's longer than what would be if your hand was relaxed by your side, if it's touching the ground, you're going to need to change the way you fight to not hit the ground as you swing. And that's going to have an impact on the way you fight and the way you move. Otherwise, have a bit of a think about it, have a think about how you'd like to fight and what you're working on, and you can adjust your weaponry to suit your needs.